What's good? It's Woog. We have Jaime Munguia, 41 wins, 0 losses, taking on Sergiy Derevyanchenko, 14 wins and 4 losses. This fight is kind of going under the radar, and I feel like there is a contingent within the boxing community that has somewhat stopped taking Jaime Munguia's career seriously, mostly because of his fight-by-fight opponent quality. I mean, most of us remember when he kind of took the 154 division by storm when he beat an outsized, I will say, Saddam Ali, but he being Munguia, came in and totally devastated Saddam Ali, capturing the WBO 154-pound title. So at this point, he pretty much put the boxing world on notice. And in his very next fight, he fought Liam Smith and beat him. It was a rugged, competitive fight. Liam Smith fought pretty valiantly, but Jaime Munguia was just too much. And then 3 fights later, he has a fight with Dennis Hogan. And to most people's eyes, Dennis Hogan outboxed Jaime Munguia, but Jaime Munguia was granted a majority decision win. Like, a lot of people feel like Jaime Munguia got away with one there. And then he has one more fight at 154 against Patrick Eloti, and this is his 5th title defense of that WBO 154-pound belt. And then he moves up to 160. And this is where the problem starts, because his next several fights, I'll give you who the opponents were. Gary O'Sullivan, Toriano Johnson, which ended up being like a firefight. Go rewatch Munguia versus Toriano Johnson. Not an A-level opponent, but that was a very difficult fight for Jaime Munguia. Toriano Johnson basically gave as good as he got before he got his lip completely split, to where they then stopped the fight. And Jaime Munguia was granted a 6-round TKO. And then after Toriano Johnson, he fights Kamil Zurameta. He fights Gabriel Rosado. This is a way post-prime Gabe Rosado, and I always felt that Gabe Rosado's surprise knockout over Bec Bully just kind of extended Gabe Rosado career-wise to where he ended up in a bunch of fights that he didn't really need to be in that stage of his career. But that's what a surprise knockout versus a surging prospect will get you. Well, after knocking Bec Bully out, Gabe Rosado was awarded, for lack of a better term, a fight against Jaime Munguia. And just rewatch that fight. I mean, Jaime Munguia put a pretty bad beating on Gabriel Rosado. Now, Gabe Rosado has a heart as big as anyone's heart, so he did endure a unanimous decision loss. But man, I mean, Jaime Munguia throws absolute lasers, and he's got such heavy artillery. So that's another win for Jaime Munguia. Then he fights Demetrius Ballard, and that ends up being his whole middleweight career, at least as it stands, because his next 2 fights after that were at 168 against Jimmy Kelly and against Gonzalo Correa. So again, his last several opponents have been, since he entered 160, Gary O'Sullivan, Toriano Johnson, Kamil Zurameta, Gabriel Rosado, Demetrius Ballard, and that's it for 160, and then Jimmy Kelly and Gonzalo Correa. I mean, you want to talk about a subpar stretch of opponents for somebody the caliber of Jaime Munguia. Yeah, this has gotten a lot of boxing fans to kind of stop caring about Jaime Munguia, because he's one of the funner fights to watch. I mean, I think that he's improved his overall game, like skill set wise. I think he uses his jab very well. He's not a terrible defensive fighter. He's putting a lot of pieces together. But man, when you want to talk about a career that's being protected by his promoter, in this case, Golden Boy, Oscar De La Hoya and company, I mean, you look at his fight over fight management, and you look at some of the opportunities that Jaime Munguia passed up. He was a multiple-time mandatory challenger for Demetrius Andrade's WBO 160-pound belt, and each time he passed that up. And let me know in the comments other big opportunities and, you know, good opportunities that Jaime Munguia and his team have passed up. I mean, I remember they were close, if you believe the parties involved, they were close to making Jermall Charlo versus Jaime Munguia for Jermall Charlo's belt, but they couldn't agree to which platform this would be fought on, you know, between PBC and Showtime, and then Golden Boy and DAZN. Yeah, they couldn't get that one together. And then Jaime Munguia ends up taking like another subpar opponent. So it's just been a very frustrating experience witnessing his career. And yes, he does still have time. He's still only 26 years old. but it seems like it was only yesterday when he fought and beat Saddam Ali, stopping him. And that was now like 5-6 years ago. So time moves pretty quickly. Before you know it, Jaime Munguia is going to be pushing 30. And what will he have had to show for it? I mean, I'm sure he's getting paid pretty well for each one of these fights. So if that's the sole goal is to make money and not really establish a legacy, well, then he and his team are doing that pretty well. But if you want people to take your career seriously and you want to have a legacy that will stand the test of time to where, you know, in retrospect, you will be looked upon favorably by the boxing community. I mean, for what it's worth. Maybe he doesn't care about that. But if you do, you're going to need to step up your opponent quality. And I do think that this opponent in Sergiy Derevyanchenko is a step in the right direction. I mean, you could argue that this is his best opponent to date. I mean, it would only be a few other people that you could even consider alongside Derevyanchenko. I mean, who do you want to consider? Saddam Ali? Again, this was a 147-pound Saddam Ali who was fighting up at 154, so maybe not. I mean, Liam Smith, in retrospect, now we could look at Liam Smith's career and he has had a good career. But at the time that he was fighting Jaime Munguia, people pretty much expected Jaime Munguia to win that fight. And then who else? I mean, Dennis Hogan ended up being a very tough fight for Munguia, but on paper, leading into the fight, nobody was really taking that opponent super seriously. Like, oh, Jaime Munguia is about to fight Dennis Hogan. No, there was none of that. It was like, when is Jaime Munguia going to fight a very good fighter? Well, now in Sergiy Derevyanchenko, we do have a quality opponent. And Derevyanchenko, you know, he didn't take up the sport until he was like in his 20s, which makes his, you know, his nickname and his style kind of interesting, because usually if somebody picks up the sport very late, unless you're like Bernard Hopkins, who ended up being a technician, which is Derevyanchenko's nickname, usually it's somebody who's just a physical anomaly with God-given abilities and power. Think Deontay Wilder, who could pick up the sport late and be able to thrive. Joe Joyce, another one. Anthony Joshua, another one. But Sergiy Derevyanchenko has built a well-rounded skill set, and even though he picked up the sport late, you look at his, we'll call it semi-pro career when he was involved in the World Series of Boxing. I mean, he was a multiple-time champion in that regard. I mean, I think his only loss was to Brian Castano, the guy who was fighting Jermell Charlo twice in the battles for Undisputed. Derevyanchenko had a pretty good pre-professional career, even though he started very late. So yeah, he goes by the technician. He won his first 12 professional fights. One of them, by the way, was against the same Toriano Johnson I just mentioned, and Derevyanchenko stopped Toriano Johnson in the final round, in the 12th round. And then Derevyanchenko gets a shot against Daniel Jacobs for the vacant IBF middleweight title. And this was kind of interesting because both Daniel Jacobs and Derevyanchenko had the same trainer, Andre Rozier. Rozier cornered Daniel Jacobs, the more popular, esteemed fighter between the two. And this ended up being a razor close fight where, you know, it really could have gone either way. Daniel Jacobs ended up winning a split decision over Derevyanchenko, and then Derevyanchenko wins his next fight, and then he goes on a 3-fight losing streak against Triple G in a very good fight that many believe that Triple G should have lost. A lot of people think that Derevyanchenko won that fight. I remember watching that fight thinking, damn, he's really putting a beating on Triple G's body to where you could see Triple G visibly bothered, which, you know, it's interesting. Triple G in his whole career has never hit the canvas. I mean, I don't think enough is discussed about that fact. But yeah, Derevyanchenko fought a phenomenal fight against Triple G. Triple G did surge and rally late in the fight, which is how he ended up pulling it off. And by the way, it was a unanimous decision win for Triple G. But I remember when I was listening to the scorecards being read off, again, as I'm watching the fight, I thought based on the unanimity in the scorecards that Derevyanchenko had beaten Triple G via unanimous decision. So I was pretty surprised when they announced that Golovkin won that fight, but that was Derevyanchenko's second loss. And again, it was a very close loss, just like his loss against Daniel Jacobs was a very close loss. And then he lost a little bit more convincingly against Jermall Charlo in September of 2020. I remember that was a pay-per-view inexplicably with Jermall Charlo versus Derevyanchenko, and then Jermell Charlo against Jason Rosario. But this ended up being a very good performance from Jermall Charlo. I think it's one of Jermall Charlo's best career performances. I mean, you would put it up there with, his knockout win over Julian J. Rock Williams. Jermall Charlo's only had one fight since that impressive unanimous decision win over Derevyanchenko. But after that loss to Jermall Charlo, Derevyanchenko then fights Carlos Adames about a little more than a year later. And this ended up being a very interesting fight because Carlos Adames was coming in. He was, in his mid-20s, very young fighter. And he came on so strong and so hot to where, he had Derevyanchenko rocked a couple times. Like, I was thinking in a couple key points, damn, is he about to drop Derevyanchenko? Is he about to stop Derevyanchenko? But Derevyanchenko did have a better second half of that fight to where he lost via majority decision as opposed to Adames pulling away on the scorecards. It ended up being a relatively close fight. So that ended up being Derevyanchenko's fourth loss, and it doesn't look great because that's 4 losses now in his last 5 fights, but he has had one fight since. It was in July of last year, 2022, against Joshua Conley, not Joshua Clottey, but Joshua Conley, and Derevyanchenko won that fight via unanimous decision. So a lot of people think that Derevyanchenko's best days are behind him. Again, he had a late start career-wise, so he is now already 37 years old. He's 11 years older than Jaime Munguia. So what do I expect between Munguia and Derevyanchenko? Well, first, again, I'm just glad that Munguia has a live body in front of him. Somebody who is at least a B+ level fighter. At one point, maybe A-, but you get what I'm saying. Probably a B+, A-ish fighter. He might be post-prime, he being Derevyanchenko. But this, I believe, is still probably Jaime Munguia's best opponent, at least since leaving 154. Again, super disappointing career at 160, but this fight is at 168, which kind of adds a caveat to this, right? Opponent quality wise. It's like Jaime Munguia is fighting a good fighter, but outside of that good fighter's division. Derevyanchenko is not a 168 guy. This will only be, I believe, his second 168-pound fight. But look, Derevyanchenko at his best has pretty fast feet, and he could get inside. He stays pretty low. He's only 5'9" to Jaime Munguia 6'1". So Derevyanchenko, when he's at his best, throws very good combinations. Like, he really puts his punches together. He's got a nice overhand right, and he works the body pretty ferociously. So he could get in there, gets in and out. He's again a pretty good boxer where he hides his head pretty well. But I feel like his legs, or at least his ability to exit at an angle while keeping his head off the center line, I feel like in those fights against Jermall Charlo and even more so against Carlos Adames, I feel like that ability has slipped a little bit. I remember talking about this when analyzing the Devin Haney versus Lomachenko fight before it went down, about the legs and about how those are the first to go, and it's a lot of your angling and your movements that are hindered, especially if you like to bend at the waist and bend at the legs and move your head. That becomes tougher to do when you get into your mid-30s. And I also was discussing this when talking about Teofimo Lopez's upcoming title challenge against Josh Taylor. Josh Taylor, I think, has perhaps slipped a little bit in terms of his legs and his ability to move and exit and get in and out. Derevyanchenko, will see, but I don't think this is the same technician that we saw against Daniel Jacobs or even against Triple G. So I think that he's going to take a lot of vicious shots from Jaime Munguia. In fact, I think Jaime Munguia is probably going to have Derevyanchenko in trouble in at least a couple moments of this fight. Like, I kind of think Munguia is going to drop Derevyanchenko. The question is, will Derevyanchenko's offensive attributes that usually work for him, will they work and be effective against Munguia? Like, if we look at the guys who Munguia has had trouble against, it was either Toriano Johnson, who's able to throw a lot of combinations, and, Jaime Munguia was getting hit a decent amount against Gary O'Sullivan. So yeah, a fighter can take a very aggressive approach and have some success against Jaime Munguia. But the chances are he's got more firepower than you do. So what's the other style that gives Jaime Munguia some issues? Well, what about a more of a sweet science style boxer like Dennis Hogan? Well, Derevyanchenko is a good boxer, but he's not that type of boxer. He's a good boxer in the sense that he's able to kind of dictate the terms of the exchange, and he's able to craftily kind of get in and let his hands go. So it's going to be interesting to see how Jaime Munguia fights somebody this much shorter. Again, Munguia's got an improving jab. So is he going to be able to keep Derevyanchenko at range to where Derevyanchenko is going to be at the end of Munguia's punches? Or is Derevyanchenko going to be able to kind of flash and get inside and make Munguia have to shorten his punches, or make Munguia have to back up or step away? If Derevyanchenko could start backing Munguia up, then we know he's starting to have success. But if Derevyanchenko is like kind of getting hit from the outside, if you guys are old schoolers, you might remember Vladimir Klitschko against a very old Ray Mercer. Ray Mercer was just at the end of the very tall Vladimir Klitschko's jabs, left hooks, and straight rights until he got stopped. If you see Derevyanchenko looking like he's struggling to get in on Jaime Munguia, that's a bad sign for Derevyanchenko. But Munguia, he doesn't control range in that way. It's almost like he is looking to blast you, but I don't think he's going to do a ton to stop Derevyanchenko from being able to collapse the pocket. If Derevyanchenko, again, still has legs that are even as close to as agile as they were 2, 3, 4 years ago. I just think that at a point, even if Derevyanchenko does have some success getting inside in the early rounds, I think that when we start hitting like the 4th, 5th, 6th rounds, Jaime Munguia is going to start being able to open up, being able to keep Derevyanchenko at the end of his punches a lot more. And again, I think that at some point, Derevyanchenko is going to get sat down by either a strong right hand or maybe even a left hook. I mean, Munguia likes to throw some nasty combinations, and I wonder how strong he's going to be at 168, because I suspect Jaime Munguia, being like a 6'1" guy, and he's not as skinny as he used to be, I would imagine that him getting down to 160 was probably a bit of a struggle in his last couple 160-pound fights. So I'm kind of expecting his punching power to carry to 168. But this is a little bit of an assumption. I mean, that's an 8-pound gap, whereas, you know, between 154 and 160, that's just, you know, a 6-pound gap. Not everybody who's a hard puncher at 160 ends up being a very hard puncher at 168, but I'm assuming that Jaime Munguia will, and it does again help his case that he's fighting basically a blown up 160 guy, the 5'9" Derevyanchenko. So I'm expecting Jaime Munguia to probably drop Derevyanchenko, but this is a 10-round fight, not a 12-rounder. So I think that Derevyanchenko will have the resilience and the durability to make it the 10-round distance, and I'm expecting Jaime Munguia to win a 10-round decision win. If this was a 12-rounder, I would have probably taken Munguia via late stoppage, but because it's a 10-rounder, I'm gonna go Jaime Munguia via decision. So yeah, let me know what you think about Munguia versus Derevyanchenko. Do you respect this opponent selection, especially compared to Munguia's past opponents? Do you think the technician still has enough left in the tank, and at 168 in this case, to really give Munguia a run for his money? And if Munguia wins, what do you think is next? Do you think they revisit Jermall Charlo versus Munguia? Do you think they somehow make a Matchroom / Golden Boy showdown between maybe Jaime Munguia and Edgar Berlanga? I would actually really like to see that one. That would be a fun fight, and I think I would probably lean Munguia. But yeah, what do you think would be next for Munguia if he gets by Sergiy Derevyanchenko? Please let me know in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.